Hi, how are you?
Hey,
Hi,
hello, hello. Just so everybody knows, we're recording.
we are. I'm running
Yeah.
downstairs really fast. My mom doesn't do scary movies. I'm at my parents' house today, and we were talking about your book. We had started to kick off the conversation, and she was like, "Oh my God." I was like, "I'm gonna take this
You didn't want to
downstairs."
overhear it?
No, she does not. She'll have nightmares.
Fair enough.
Hi, Grady. Thanks for joining
Hey,
us today.
no,
We're
thanks for having
excited
me.
to have you.
No, I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here.
We were just all saying how much we like the concept of The Last Girl.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, well, Final Girls have sort of always been around, but it was really Carol Clover kind of coined the term
Oh, okay.
in the 90s. She wrote a book called Men, Women, and Chainsaws that was sort of a feminist horror book, sort of a feminist take on horror films. And yeah, so it's sort of stuck since then. But yeah, no, it's something that's kind of been around, and I feel like by now it's kind of seeped into the cultural mainstream.
We like the way that you carried that out, The Final Girl. That was
So thanks. I
everybody.
appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, I didn't know if anyone had any questions they wanted to start with, or how you guys usually do this. It's your book club.
I
Yeah,
think
we
Brittany
usually
has some.
questions. So one of my questions was the characters that you developed, do you base them on anybody you know in real life, or how do you develop them, and who was the most challenging, and who was your favorite when you were writing this one?
Yeah, well, I mean, everyone in my books is based on someone in real life, whether it's someone I know or someone I saw on the subway or something like that. I mean, I always sort of start with something real, but it's no one ever recognizes themselves, and by the time they get onto the page, there's so many other things going on that it's not really any one person by then. But with this, I wanted to use the sort of iconic slashers. Even if people aren't a horror movie fan, they know the summer camp slasher, the prom night killer, the family of redneck cannibals that you're always worried about bumping into in the country.
Yeah.
So I sort of had that as a starting place. And then in terms of the ones who are tough to write, um, weirdly, Lynette was pretty easy. Lynette was just the strangest because I started out sort of Lynette being me, sort of. I always figured if I was in this situation, I'd be a Lynette, I'd arm up and I'd become a badass and learn karate and have all these different escape routes and all these things. And as I started to write the book, I realized that those things that I thought would make me kind of cool and able to protect myself were actually just dysfunctional, and would mean that I couldn't really have a relationship with another human being, and would leave me kind of isolated and on the margins. And so that was sort of an interesting thing to be dealing with as I started the book. I mean, I really thought Lynette would be this sort of badass character, and rapidly realized that that just wasn't the case. And then but the hardest character to write, I think, was Adrian, because Adrian started out with a really weird thing, which was that I knew I wanted her to be Black. And just because I always thought it was so strange that there weren't really any Black final girls in the classic slashers. And I knew I wanted it to be sort of the first one, because I thought, oh, if anyone, Oprah was kind of looming large in my mind when I started this book in 2014. And these days, I think the equivalent would be Elizabeth Smart, but someone who sort of took what happened to them and turned it into a way to reach out and kind of help other people going through the same thing. But it still left me with this unpleasant fact that a cliche of a lot of horror movies is that, not a lot, a cliche about horror movies is that the Black character dies first. And here I was with a Black character who dies off screen, off page first. And it took me a long time to sort of wrap my head around that. And so I really wanted to make sure as the book went on that she was a presence throughout, and that she was, with memories and flashbacks and dreams and that stuff, really actively engaged, and that the end of the book actually takes place in this camp she's built, And also, there's a part of the book that I wound up sort of seeing as the book being a conversation between Adrian and Lynette. I mean, sort of one of those between the lines things that always engaging for a writer, but whether readers notice or not isn't really that important. It's kind of part of the like the bone structure behind the book. But is that one of the reasons the support group is still around is because Adrian has kept it together because of Lynette. You know, Lynette is still not there. And the book, to a large extent, is Lynette coming around to where Adrian was, you know, where she winds up not killing Stephanie, but helping Stephanie, where she has this, embraces the same philosophy of not leaving anyone behind that Adrian had. So that was sort of this weird thing that sort of grew as I was writing the book. And then the character who's the most fun to write is Heather. Heather's kind of my favorite in the book because she's based on this kind of dream killer that I think we all know from, you know, that's always sort of been out there, and Nightmare on Elm Street with Freddy Krueger made it really popular. But I always thought there was nothing more violating than someone who would be inside your head. And the fact that all these things have happened to Heather and people don't really believe them, they think she's exaggerating or made some of them up or something like that. That's always, to me, you know, makes it even worse. And in a lot of ways, she's kind of the secret hero of the book who winds up saving Lynette at the end. And so Heather was a lot of fun. It's always fun to write characters who are assholes. They sort of are able to sort of just flip the cable and take everything in a new direction.
So why the horror genre of all the genres to write? I'm a big horror movie fan, but writing it, I think, would be a challenge, but a good one. So why that genre?
There wasn't really any like intentionality. Like, I think it's with every job, you kind of wind up where you wind up through a combination of sort of, you know, accidents and where your life kind of leads you. And that I wasn't a big horror reader as a kid. I mean, I read King at like 11 and 12, which I think was in a lot of people first encounter Stephen King. But I generally found the covers too kind of gross for me to really get into the books. But, you know, as I got older and was writing, I realized that the stuff I wrote that people liked was what leaned more horror. And I also noticed as I was getting older that there wasn't a lot going on in horror in the early 2000s. And that there was a lot of room to sort of do your own thing there, rather than science fiction and fantasy were both huge in the early 2000s. And they were both, you know, there was a real way to do it, you know, and horror, there wasn't really much. I mean, most Barnes and Nobles got rid of their horror sections in the early 2000s.
Really? I don't think
That's interesting.
I know.
They're starting to bring them back, but they were gone late 90s, early 2000s. And then the other thing is really, I mean, to me, horror is just real life, but more interesting. One reason, I mean, I read a ton of sci-fi when I was a kid, but as an adult, I kind of am like, well, it mostly takes place, not all of it, but to generalize wildly, it takes place on other planets or in the future, or, you know, fantasy takes place in a secondary world or you know, at another time. And horror really takes place now and here for the most part. And it's more interesting, you know, it's instead of people talking about their affairs and, you know, things like that, they're turning into werewolves and dealing with ghosts. And so it just looks a lot more like real life to me.
I find that more interesting personally than the sci-fi. My husband loves sci-fi, and you know, we watch things together as far as streaming and things separately, and separately watching the sci-fi. And I also have to say, before I forget, is that I did like a lot of the humor and the wit that was in here. It really,
oh, thanks.
Yeah, especially at the end, just having the setting when they're having that final running through, and it's in the spa area.
Right.
They're tussling in this room, you know, the reflection room and the tranquility, and that's pretty funny.
Yeah, no, I had been to a spa like that years ago, like a camp kind of spa thing. And I just remember thinking like, God, really, these rooms are really like, can only do one thing here. Like, you know,
So
but yeah,
there was a lot of that in there, and there was a lot like, and you already mentioned this, that, you know, someone like me, now my daughter's here, and she watches the horror movies and I don't, yet I was still able to get probably 90% of the references just because
right.
they're there, even if I haven't seen the movie. I'm like, oh yeah. And we were talking earlier about how funny the sequels were. You know,
Oh
there was
yeah,
one that had what, 10 sequels or whatever.
right.
Yeah.
Oh, the Summer Slaughter. Yeah. Adrian's franchise. Yeah, no, those were fun to do just because, you know, those are the things I grew up on. Like most people, I watched horror movies with my friends as a kid. And so you kind of grow up on this stuff. And even as a kid, you know, it's ridiculous. And I think that's one of the things that people forget when they criticize stuff. Like I know that I remember, gosh, a few years ago, there was this real kind of axe to grind that a lot of culture writers had with like reality TV and things like The Bachelor and Survivor and you know, Love Island UK and stuff. And I've always been aware, and maybe it's because I grew up watching horror, but that people watch things generally with two eyes. Like they kind of have this like binocular vision of I mean, not just literally, but you can take it seriously, but also have an ironic distance from it at the same time. Like, I don't know anyone who watches The Real Housewives of whatever county seriously, but they love it. And their love for it is genuine. And the pleasure it gives them is genuine. But they also have an ironic relationship with it. And I find the same with horror. Even as kids, we knew the endless sequels were ridiculous.
Yeah.
A lot of romance readers I know, like who are big romance fans, they love the genre, but they can be like, oh, it's another bonnet ripper, or you know, something, you know, they have a sort of like, they like to make fun of it as much as they enjoy it. And so I always think that when people start criticizing a genre, they're losing sight of the fact that most people who love it, they know what its weaknesses are.
Right.
And and making fun of those weaknesses is part of the love.
I think that's very refreshing to hear it that way, because I, with, you know, very literary type background and other books that I read, yet I watch the Hallmark movies. So,
Right.
which
No,
is
exactly.
the same story every single time.
My
But if
mom-
I'm in the kitchen cooking or whatever, doing something, there's nothing I like better than to have a Hallmark movie on, you know?
Oh,
And
exactly.
it's somehow very, you know, uplifting, but I make fun of them. But at the same time, that's what I go to. So there you are.
Right. What were you saying, Brittany?
I was going to say my mom and I have been watching them all weekend. The Christmas one started.
Yeah.
And so there's new ones already, and we've watched like 5 this weekend. So I was like, that's what came over and that's what we did. So my dad and I always watch scary movies, and I've always been a fan of horror because of that. And then I always say my mom and I watch Hallmark and Lifetime, basically. So
Right.
Yeah, so you're
Sometimes-
balanced.
Yeah.
sometimes
Well, it was
Lifetime's a
fun.
little too scary for her. You know what I'm saying? Like we were watching a Hallmark movie and the guy's driving really fast in the car and she's like, oh my goodness, do you think he's gonna crash? And I'm like, no, mom, it's Hallmark. I'm like, if it's Lifetime, yes, it's Hallmark, so no.
I like that that's the demarcation line, risk versus no risk. But yeah, you know, as a kid, I remember, you know, I had a really good friend who was older than I was, who was really into Westerns. And my mom and my older sister were really into mysteries. And my grandfather was really into professional wrestling. And I was watching horror movies, and each of them had nothing but contempt for each other's chosen genre. But they were all so similar, you know, this sort of serial entertainment, we're making fun of it's part of the joy of it, and the familiarity is part of the joy of it. And so I find, and someone was saying that we live in this age of serial entertainment, right? Where you look at all these movie franchises like the Marvel movies and the James Bond movies, and that's sort of, you know, now things are sort of always a remake or a sequel or something. And a lot of people feel like when that sort of went mainstream is with the slasher movies in the early 80s, late 70s, when people started to realize just infinite sequels weren't necessarily a bad thing. And I mean, granted, you had like serial movies, you know, Westerns and things like that, and romances and nurse books and things in the 50s. But it really was the first time in the modern era when you could get up to a part 10 and realize, oh, we're still making money. We're doing fine.
Yeah,
And
that's
hey,
very interesting.
how
You know,
much you know?
going back to Adrian, it's interesting you wrote this book, and then of course just recently we've gone through this situation, and I of course remember the young lady's name who they found her body recently, and they know that the boyfriend did it, and they've
Oh,
said
right.
this, you know. So, and again, there was all this about, well, of course you're covering it 24/7 because it's a pretty young white girl, and what
Right.
about all these indigenous girls and all these African American girls and all these women of color who are missing and nobody ever says a word. And yet, you know, your book really played into that, even though you'd written it obviously before. Once again, we're reminded of this big dichotomy between the races when it comes to attention for.
Yeah, and that's something that's always been there, and it's starting to change now. And there were sort of two things with that. One is that a lot of serial killers traditionally kill within their own ethnic group, and it wasn't until pretty recently that you know, the profile of serial killer used to be a white male. And it wasn't until recently people realized, well, no, it could be, you know, there are female serial killers, obviously, but, you know, the type we see most often in movies could also be Black or Asian. Charles Ng is a famously Asian serial killer in the US. And, but also, one of the big things that happened was we weren't investigating crimes with Black victims the same way. And because a lot of victims of serial killers are lower income, they live sort of on the margins, white or Black. They're many times sex workers or have substance abuse issues. They're often very poor or blue collar. And, you know, so people were just, you know, when it came to Black or non-white victims, people were like, oh, well, that happens. These women go missing. They get in trouble. But now, you know, as they've started to investigate these crimes with a little less of a racial bias in it, and not completely by any measure, you start to realize people like the Grim Sleeper in LA, who was a Black man murdering women over, I think, 30 years. There was a serial killer in North Carolina who was mostly targeting sex workers in unincorporated townships who were Black. And because there was confusion over law enforcement jurisdiction, and because the victims were Black and sex workers, it wasn't taken. No one ever thought to put those pieces together. But now we're starting to, you know, have a clearer view of this kind of thing. And it's interesting to me because ultimately the only people who get hurt by this are, it's sort of like cutting off your nose to spite your face. For years and years, the police were just not considering that a Black or non-white killer or suspect could be a serial killer. And suddenly we're like, oh, wait, I guess. And, you know, right, exactly. And so it's been a really interesting thing to see that change. And that was also, and then the other part of it was also that horror movies have always had a huge blind spot. Well, actually, slasher movies have always had a huge blind spot with Black characters. Weirdly enough, non-horror, non-slasher movies have actually done a pretty good job with it. George Romero, who made the three giant famous zombie movies, Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead, and Day of the Dead, Night was in the 60s and famously has a Black main character, and so does Dawn. And so does Dawn, and so does Day. There was Candyman, which is a famous movie with a Black lead from the 80s, which got remade recently.
He's still scary. That guy is still scary.
Yeah, exactly. But movies like Aliens, they all have prominent non-white characters. And so it's interesting that slashers just always seem to have this blind spot. And often they would have Black victims, but like in Friday the 13th movies, the Black victims were usually gang members who happened to stumble into the camp rather than being other counselors. So it was just a weird blind spot that really just seems to be in slasher movies.
That's it. All that is fascinating, really.
But it's one reason, you know, that Marilyn is Latina, because I just thought, you know, with the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, I was like, it's so much more interesting if it's a non-white person, like because I mean the famous thing about Texas Chainsaw Massacre is, you know, it's two families running into each other. This sort of middle class white family and this family of cannibal rednecks. And I always thought, well, it'd be interesting if it was a middle class, upper middle class Latin family, because that's such a part of Texas in a really unique way.
What kind of research did you do for writing this book?
Most of my research was pretty limited when it came to horror. And that's usually the way it is. Usually I'll read one or two books, usually one nonfiction and one fiction book. That's not by planning, that's just what happens. When I did this book called The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires, right before this, I wound up just reading Dracula and this book by this crazy Anglican minister from the 20s named Montague Summers called The Vampire in Europe. And Montague Summers wrote a lot of, but he wrote a book about witches and werewolves and all in the teens, the 20s and 30s. And mostly they're very helpful collections of folklore, but he writes about them as if they're real. And I think he actually thought they were. And so they're really crazy, but really useful. So with this, the nonfiction book I wound up reading was Marina Warner, who's a folklorist. She wrote a book called No Go the Boogeyman, which is a sort of history of the boogeyman figure in Western culture, which was really, really helpful. And then the other book, so it's weird. I was talking to a friend of mine who also had a Final Girl book come out this summer. And independently of each other, we sort of did the same thing, which was both of us wanted to read in the genre we were writing in, like what came before us, what pitfalls do you avoid, what things can you do better? And we both realized there weren't many slasher books. That they're serial killer books, but sort of that slasher thing is really more about movies. And both of us wound up going back to fairy tales. Because, you know, Little Red Riding Hood is a proto slasher. It's a teenage girl who goes into the woods, is specifically told not to do something. She does it. She encounters immediately this male monster and has to get the better of him by outsmarting him and being resourceful. And there's a whole thing with disguises and dressing up like the grandmother and all that. And so the book I wound up reading probably 2 or 3 times while I was writing this was this book by Angela Carter from the 70s called The Bloody Chamber, which is her rewriting of fairy tales. And it's a really sort of landmark feminist book. It's very sensual, very tactile, very erotic, very violent. And the stories are really beautiful. But so that's what I went back to. And then once I finished the book, to sort of do these shows I do these one-person shows instead of an author event where I read from the book. For that, I was just watching and reading everything I could get my hands on. And that was really interesting to sort of trace back the slasher to you know, the first big celebrity killer who was Jack the Ripper, and how there was a lot of fan fiction written about Jack the Ripper that I think sort of provided a lot of the first fictional slashers or serial killers in fiction. People were writing even before the Ripper had finished killing people, because he only killed between a 6-month period in 1888, and he killed 5 women in this very limited period. And even right in the middle of that, before he had gotten to victim number 5, people were publishing books written by Jack the Ripper or Jack the Ripper's diaries.
Yeah.
And you know, a German book about Sherlock Holmes capturing Jack the Ripper. And then the big place where that Jack the Ripper fan fiction that was so popular, and a lot of it appeared in magazines, a big place where that went mainstream was a story called The Lodger in 11, but I might be a little wrong. But The Lodger was published in Maclean's magazine, and Gertrude Stein was a big fan of it. Ernest Hemingway loved it. And then Alfred Hitchcock made it into a movie in 1926 called The Lodger. And so you can sort of draw a line from that to, and he always wanted to remake The Lodger in America later when he was making color films in the 50s and 60s, but could never clear the rights. But, you know, Psycho is, you know, and Frenzy, both of his movies about men killing women, both have a lot of similarities to this Jack the Ripper fan fiction and The Lodger. But more than that, the thing that was really interesting was to look at urban legends. There were these urban legends that really, three in particular, that really shaped the slasher genre. And the most famous of which was an urban, I think everyone's heard of The Hook, you know, about this young couple and they're necking and
That's from like my childhood. It predates these ladies, but that's from way back. That was always told at slumber parties, you know,
exactly
from our older brothers and sisters. So it's been around a while.
Yeah. And actually, you know, it's sort of the slasher movie right there. It's kids in the woods trying to have sex. They run into a nameless, faceless killer with an unusual weapon, his hook, and they barely get away. And the Hook, which is really interesting to me, actually starts in 1947 with there was a thing in LA called the Red Light Bandit, which was a guy who was ultimately caught named Carol Chessman, who was robbing and sexually assaulting kids in lovers' lanes parked around the city. And he would use a red light on his car to make them think he was a police officer. And he attacked a large number, I think it was 11 attacks, and LA was really in this grip of terror. And Chessman, famously, he was given a capital trial and found guilty of capital crimes because they used an anti-kidnapping law against him because he dragged one of his victims 22 feet from their car. So even though he never killed anyone, he was executed. But he was a big publicity hound and actually wrote 4 best-selling books from death row and claimed that he didn't do it and that the real killer was still, or the real red light bandit was still out there. And what's really interesting is a lot of people who study folklore point to 1960 being this year that Hook stories seem to have exploded all over America, and including in November of 1960, when the Hook ran in Dear Abby, the syndicated advice columnist's column, as a real thing that had happened to someone writing in. And 1960 was also the year that, in a huge cloud of publicity and controversy, Carol Chessman was executed in California. So it's this really interesting thing that you get to this urban legend that sort of, you know, and then you get to the urban legend, the roommate, about the college roommates, and one goes out and one stays home, and there are different versions on them getting killed. And then the other one's the babysitter and the man upstairs, where someone's babysitting and getting these calls saying, I'm going to kill you. And the police trace the calls, and the calls are coming from inside the house, and she barely gets away with her life. And so sort of those 3 really shaped slashers. And in, you know, and a lot of people point to Halloween that came out in 1978 as being the first big slasher. But weirdly enough, there was a movie called Black Christmas that's based on the babysitter and the man upstairs that came out in 1974. But even before that, there was a short film called Foster's Release that's played in 1971 from USC Film School. And it's about 14 minutes long. And it's a classic, you know, woman's babysitting, teenagers babysitting, gets the calls, I'm going to kill you. Calls are coming from inside the house. She gets the kids out barely in time, fights back, barely lives. It's this crazy guy who escaped from prison, or no, was released on parole. But what's really interesting about Foster's Release to me is it only played like 2 film festivals. It's 14 minutes long. And you sort of think, well, what kind of influence can that possibly have? But John Carpenter was one of the director's classmates who, you know, would go on to make Halloween. But to me, even more interesting than that is that Foster's Release was actually rented out to high school home economics classes throughout the 1970s and showed all across America in high schools everywhere. And in the sales materials for it, it was designed to show quick thinking and proper crisis response in teenagers who are babysitting.
That's wild. That is wild.
So this weird proto slasher movie got shown in all these high school home economics classes, which were mostly young women were in the classes. So it's such a weird thing to me that was, you know, and I'm sure teachers, it's the same thing as like putting a movie on. Like, you just want the kids to shut up for 14 minutes, you know?
That is wild.
So it was really fun to do that research and sort of trace this back, but that all came after I wrote the book. Just because writing the book, you don't want to get too cluttered up with reality, because then you feel very committed to it and you wind up really stuck with it.
Uh-huh. I thought it was interesting too that you kind of played with so many times, obviously a screenplay in a movie is going to be different than a book, but you kind of played with so many of the things that would have worked in a movie about, oh, this is going to work. This weapon is going to work. This door isn't going to be stuck.
Right.
It didn't work. These people
Yeah.
are trying to do the things they've seen in movies. It's like, okay, I know what to do because I've seen these movies, and then it's like none of it works. It's like the tear gas. It doesn't work.
Well, and it's funny. I always think there's an essential moment, and I don't know if it's the same for women as it is for guys, but there's an essential moment of growing up where you actually get in a really bad fight. And you realize that it's not like the movies, and it's not like TV. And I've watched it happen to all my nephews, and it certainly happened to me as a young adult. And but where you just realize that all this stuff that looks so cool in a movie, and all this stuff that looks so tough and so cool, none of it works in real life. Like, none of it works. From the pepper spray to the martial arts to the handgun to none of it.
Poor Lynette, she kicks the guy and and it hurts like hell. And I thought, did she break her ankle? Did she break her foot? Because here she is. And you think in the movies that would have been
exactly
it. No.
And that was also something really important to me with Lynette, is I wanted every time she fought back or pulled a gun that it only made things worse or it fell apart, because I didn't want to do something that was celebrating, being a badass, because I just don't think that's functional. And it's funny. There's sort of two kinds of final girls nowadays. And there's the one I love, the one that appears a lot now, which is a lot of fun to watch in movies, is a bit of the Buffy the Vampire Slayer, right? She's or Furiosa in the Mad Max movies, or Xena, warrior princess, where it's a woman who shows up ready to rock and roll. She can hold her own physically. She's tough. She's resourceful. She's smart, and she's really ready to go. And that's fun to watch. But the final girls I really like are the ones I grew up on in the late 70s and the 80s, who weren't particularly tough or strong or even smart. A lot of times they just happened to be enormously resourceful, and they just didn't give up. They just didn't stop trying. They just didn't stop running. I mean, you look at Alice Hardy in Friday the 13th, or Laurie Strode in Halloween, or any of these final girls. They're not the best of the bunch, but they just refuse to give up. And it's, I'll keep running. Okay, this door won't work. I'll try to climb on the roof and go in a window. Okay, I'm in a closet. I have nothing. I've got a coat hanger. They just kept digging deep. And that to me was so much more inspiring than I have all this special training and I'm really strong and tough. You just sometimes don't, just surviving's a matter of not giving up. And to me, that really resonates.
I was going to say, I think that's a good takeaway for life in general, especially with the pandemic and everything that's been going on just in the world the past few years.
Yeah. Well, and that was really weird to me, to be writing this book. And I was doing lots of rewrites on the end of this book during the second wave in August of last year. And to be taking this character who lives behind locked doors and windows, who is terrified of running into a stranger because they might kill her, and who just going to the grocery store is this sort of military operation. And, in August of last year, I was living with my mom, who got really sick, and she has really bad lung disease. So we had to really be on lockdown when I was down in South Carolina taking care of her. And it was so healthy for me to write this character going from that to something more psychologically sound. That was really like my way to keep my mental health during the pandemic.
I was going to say, it was just interesting to me. I'm like, because we all kind of have to figure out what's next and live in a way that we're comfortable, but the world is not what it was.
Yeah, exactly. And it's been really interesting to see navigating social situations again, and see how some people are like, great, I'm in, I'm back. and other people are taking a much longer time, and other people,
I'm
I mean,
not. Yeah.
yeah, I've
I'm
got a
like,
friend who definitely is still isolating. You know, they're just,
Yeah.
coming to my parents was a big thing this weekend. I'm like, I just didn't want to be alone and I feel comfortable here. So I'm
yeah,
like, just I live with my dog Annabelle. And I'm like,
yeah,
sometimes you just need a person. I needed my mom.
yeah. No, no, no. I know, absolutely. And it's been really interesting too with, and is a little off topic with jobs, is just seeing people sort of my wife owns a restaurant, a couple of restaurants, and it's been really interesting to see people who just sort of, once they sort of don't have to go into work tomorrow and aren't doing 60-hour weeks, go, wait a minute, what am I doing here? Like, why, where's this taking me? And you know, and people, we've done really well because we've started paying people at 25 an hour, and we're doing a lot of training, and we're doing a lot of hands-on stuff, and really treating our workers a lot more like students in a way, than workers. It's sort of a weird thing, but my wife kind of figured all this out. It's really worked for us. And but people are just expecting a lot more, you know, and I think people are like that with social interaction. They're just suddenly a lot more conscious of it and a lot more deliberate about it. Whereas in the past, you just sort of did whatever. It didn't matter.
Well, and
Right.
that's the thing. I didn't even think like the last times I was doing things would be the last time I was at a concert. You know, when somebody's like, well, what was the
Right.
last concert you were? You know what I'm saying? All these things. And I'm like, I don't even remember. But I'm like, I wish I had known. I would
Yeah.
have treated it a little bit differently. Okay, so I heard this got picked up, the Final Girl support group. HBO picked it up.
Yes. Yeah.
Well,
It's
congratulations.
oh, thanks. Yeah. No, so yeah, this is Charlize Theron's production company's gonna be
Nice.
doing it as a series. And
Love her. I love her.
yeah, no, and I thought that it made a lot of sense. And you know, she's produced a lot of things about violence, and there's that Netflix show Mindhunter that she produces, and things like that. So it's really in the wheelhouse for her, which has been
Doesn't
great.
she have like kind of a tragic backstory with her parents?
I don't know, what's the story with that? I haven't heard.
Oh, I'll have to look it up, but I think it might be a matter of her father. You know what? I should look that up before I say anything, but I think she has some kind of a tragic family violence situation.
Oh wow, no, I didn't know. I always just chalked it up to the fact that she's South African, and every South African person I know is crazy. So
Yeah, I hope I'm not making that up, but I
no, no,
haven't.
no. I'm gonna look, definitely. If you don't find it, I'm gonna look it up because that's interesting.
So how involved are you with the whole
Um,
different authors have different levels of involvement we've learned as we've gotten to interview them and have them join the club. So how hands-on
yeah,
are you?
I'm pretty hands-on. I wasn't originally, and there's a movie of my best friend's exorcism that's coming out next year that I had very little involvement with. And there was going to be a TV version of Horror Store that I had very little involvement with, and that wound up falling apart. And I really realized through those two experiences that I really want to be involved. So Horror Store right now is going to be a feature film, and I've written the screenplay, and we're out with directors right now. We have producers on board. With Final Girl Support Group, I'm a producer on it. I'll be reading scripts and helping to interview a showrunner. Same with Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires, also going to be a show from HBO.
Nice.
I really
Wonderful.
like am doing, so I'm really involved, and I just feel like I don't want to be leading the charge, but I think it's really useful to have someone who I sort of know what these stories are, like boiled down to a sentence. And it was interesting to me with those earlier experiences. You know, a writer would come on a property that had been optioned and to turn it into a show, and they'd say, great, but there's also stuff I want to get in here that's my own stuff. And sometimes it would just start changing more and more and more from the original concept. And
Yeah.
especially in the case of the original Horror Store TV show, you kind of look around and you can't see shore anymore. You're so far out to sea. So the people working on it was great, and they were really talented and really smart, but they just couldn't crack it. And so they just kept trying to try things that took them further and further away from what it was. And so my role is to sort of keep reminding people like what this was originally. Like, and if you're going to make it different, that's great, but do it consciously and
Yeah,
for
not by
reasons that work.
accident or because you don't understand it.
Yeah, or just
Okay,
because
so
you're trying to throw things against the wall to see what sticks. Oh yeah, you've got the Charlize Theron.
yeah, just real quick. her mother killed her father. The father
Whoa.
was apparently quite full of rage and an alcoholic, and he came home and was threatening Charlize's mother and Charlize, and her mother got her gun and shot and killed the father. There weren't
Wow.
any charges brought against the mother. It was a clear case of self-defense. So
That's intense.
she's got that in her background.
Yeah. Well, that would definitely explain it, because she's always, she had that moment early on where she was sort of this ingenue, but then ever since then, she's always been really drawn to very dark, sort of very, movie lane monster and all that really look at violence.
I thought of that when you said, there are female serial killers. We don't normally see that. There aren't as many. And she
Right.
was real life, and her story really was kind of unique in that there was this real female serial killer.
Right. Yeah.
Warnos.
No,
What was
exactly.
her name?
Eileen Warnos.
Yeah.
Warnos.
Yeah. And then there's always, and I've never really seen anyone do much with them, but also the angels of death, often male or female nurses who will kill patients,
Yeah.
which I've always thought was so. I actually tried to do a book about an angel of death, and my publisher was like, absolutely not. The last thing anyone wants to read right now is something set in a hospital.
Well, I guess the timing. The
Yeah.
timing.
Maybe timing, but I would think that would be interesting and resonate with everything going on. Like,
Yeah, well, it was interesting. Two things really made me want to do that, which was, one, I was talking to a bookstore and they were telling me that they cannot keep horror on the shelves. And I was like, oh, that's really interesting. And they said, oh yeah, they said, we've been around since the 70s. And since then, our biggest seller, horror and thrillers, we can't get, and I was like, why do you think that is? And they're like, oh, because we're right across the street from a hospital. And they said, and what we get are people who are there with family and doctors and nurses. They're like, our biggest customers are doctors and nurses. And then the other thing is I started to realize that I was meeting lots of nurses at my events who were coming to events. And I was like, horror really has an appeal for people who like work in healthcare. And I thought, it would be really cool to do something set in that world that really, and I grew up, my dad's a doctor, my mom's a nurse. So I thought it'd be so cool to be in that world. But yeah, publishers are like, nothing set in a hospital.
Oh,
do you think because of right now or something?
COVID.
yeah. Couple
Yeah.
years, 3 or 4 years, we'll see that maybe it won't be so
I'm like-
sensitive.
Hopefully.
Yeah,
And
Yeah.
hopefully.
and also I feel like, I think they're wrong. I actually think people would love to read that, because I think people are fascinated by medicine right now. And I think people are looking at these nurses who are working these like 30-hour shifts and all this, and they're thinking, I don't know anything about this. Who are these people? Why do they, And so I think people are kind of fascinated by it. But one thing I learned very early on in my career is you do not want to write a book that your publisher is not excited to sell. So, and actually the book I'm just finishing up right now, that I'm doing rewrites on, that'll be out next summer, originally, and I think, I don't know, I'm sort of going back and forth with my editor, but took place in January of 2021. And so there's face masks, and COVID isn't the focus of it, but people are wearing face masks, people are having Zoom meetings, and all that stuff. And my publisher is pushing very hard to just get rid of all of that.
Still be set 2020,
Oh,
but that didn't happen, or
No, they want me to set it in
Okay.
like January 2018 or something. And
okay.
I'm a little, I don't know, I feel a little morally conflicted about that, because I do look around and see that there's sort of this push to erase. I mean, it's still going on, but to really erase 2020 and kind of, especially in books and movies and things, to just not have it. It's inconvenient, it's difficult, and then people are like, well, audiences don't want it, based on no research whatsoever. They just assume. And I feel like, I don't know, horror is that genre that's always about how you can't forget anything, right? Every ghost is like, oh, it's, a woman who married someone against her father's wishes, and he locked her in her room and she starved to death, and now she haunts the estate. Like, horror is always about the return of the repressed, the thing we wanted to go away that keeps coming back. And I kind of feel like, really, we're just gonna pretend this didn't happen, editor? Like, we're just gonna say it didn't. So we're having a bit of an issue over that right now, but we'll work it out.
Can you tell us anything else about the book?
Yeah, I mean, it's about I really wanted to write a book about a family, because I feel like one of my sisters-in-law early on, when I did this book called My Best Friend's Exorcism, was like, how come every character in books is an only child? And I was like, oh my God, you're right. Because it's complicated to write families. It's really, really hard. And so I really wanted to do a book about a family. So it's a brother, an adult brother and sister who are estranged, whose parents die, and they have to get back and sell the house, and the house is haunted by their parents. So it's coming out next summer. And right now the parents die in January of 2021. So I did a couple of funerals last year, and they're really weird things. They leave you feeling very unsettled and very unfinished. And I went to a funeral in March or April of this year, and it wasn't a very good funeral. It wasn't very well attended. It wasn't particularly inspiring. But I had underestimated what a sense of closure it would provide in a way that the sort of Zoom ones didn't. And that was something I really wanted to sort of write about, is this idea that, you do have to sort of lay things to rest. But we'll see. Still arguing with my editor.
I hope they don't take it out. I'm like, because I think that there is something that's important there to be taken away that you don't think about. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
Like, if we hadn't been to a funeral and a Zoom funeral, I'm like, but even like Zoom events and things like that, it changes. You leave a Zoom event sometimes more tired. You know what I'm saying? And everybody like, having drinks over Zoom. I'm like, I can't even imagine like a funeral to say goodbye.
Yeah. But well, and also there is a lot of, there was a whole new social manners we had to learn, right? Masking, not masking. How close do you stand to someone? How, there was a long period in New York when you'd be walking. What's that?
I said the hugging, the not touching anymore.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. There was a long period in New York where walking down the street, if someone was coming the other way, you would both sort of like cross the street. And then there was a period where you just sort of gave each other a wide berth. And now it's just, you go right by like everything's normal. So it was just really interesting to sort of navigate, how we did this,
Brittany, did you tell Grady he's our first male author?
I did not. You are.
Yes, you're our first male author to.
Oh wow!
Yeah, I was gonna say that was what I realized today when you were joining. I'm like, we haven't read a book by a male author, and we haven't had a guest that's been a male. So
guys are overrated.
No, I'm like, it's been really great though.
How long have y'all been around?
2 years.
2 years. And so how many authors have you had on?
This year we'll have almost 20. Last year I had one. So I started with one. Samantha Downing was our first, the thriller author. I love her very much. I became really good friends. And I found that the community is just really tight knit. So when you build a good relationship with one and they hear, like that they attended and enjoyed the event, somebody else is more willing to come. So this year we did 20. We got to read Emily Bleeker's book before it was out. So we did like a book club art. So if your book comes out and you need a book club to be like we wrote reviews. We did like a playlist that went along with like as our gift to her as we were reading, like the book, what it inspired basically. So we gave her, I do graphic design work. I work for the government, but I designed this like special book list of songs that correlated with everything that she used in promotion with her publisher, which was super fun.
Oh, that's really cool.
We got to read that like 3 months before it was out.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Yeah. That's awesome.
So that was fun. We're going to do it with JT Ellison next year, which I'm super excited about. She met with us this year, also a thriller author. And when she heard that we were doing that with Emily Bleeker, she's like, can I be in? And I'm like, of course. So we have to do some coordinating. I'm like, but it's just getting in and building these relationships, which has been really wonderful.
No, that's really
I'm
cool.
not going to be disparaging, but I refer to them as the Gone Girl authors because so many, so many, and they're, and that sounds like I'm really, throwing shade at them or whatever, but they are, so many of them, they're really in that I'm writing the next Gone Girl. I'm writing the next
But to be honest, I didn't love Gone
Woman
Girl.
from the Train. That's kind of their lane,
Yes.
Yeah.
that's why we've had so many, is that, and we didn't realize this because I don't know anything about the publishing business, but a lot of these authors, I mean, they will jump on a Zoom, they will interact with Brittany because there's a lot of, they're doing a lot of their own PR, and
Yeah.
in my mind, it's like they're like Stephen King and they've got a big publishing company that's really out there for them. And they're like, and they've been very honest with us when they're on the Zoom. They're like, oh no, it's kind of up to me to do
Yeah.
my PR, to do my social media. Their publishing company only goes so far, and then the rest is on them. So all the
Yeah.
help Brittany gives them and all the publicity she gets them, they're like, fine, bring it on.
I'll
Well,
make sure that girls do the reviews and things like that. You know what I'm saying? 'Cause
yeah,
there's
no,
things
which
that
is
I know
great.
that help. So giving back
Well,
especially.
yeah, no, which is great. And I was going to say what Phyllis was saying, trust me, my publisher was very happy that the title of this book had the word girl in it.
Oh, really?
Oh, that's the secret sauce in publishing these days.
That's interesting.
Well, there you go. But like I say, they're all, they're not all. That's not true. That's not fair to the authors we've had. But you can tell with several of them that that's what's playing in their head is Gone
Right.
Girl.
Right. And she hasn't done a book since then, which I think is so weird.
Oh, she has.
It was a slow book until the end. Like it got really good at the end and I'm like, and now it's over. Like it was one of those books that when I started, it was like pre-book club, but my friend and I always read the same books in tandem, which is why I created the book club. So I had people to talk about everything that I was reading with. And I was like, I wanted to put it down. And I'm usually not a quitter with books or anything in life. And she's like, no, you just have to get to the end. You have to get to the end. And then it got to that part that it was really good and it was over. And I'm like, oh.
Well, one of her earlier books is actually, to me, much better. Sharp Objects, which they made into a television series with
HBO picked that up.
Amy Adams, I think it was. And
Yeah.
that book to me was much better. So who knows how this works with the entertainment industry and that, and why Gone Girl got made into the feature film and really took off. But I'm sure Grady has more perspective on that because he's seen that side of it.
Well, it's always hard to know what's going to take off and what doesn't. But Gone Girl was really the right book at the right time, and it's I get why Brittany, I get why you don't like it. I really liked it a lot, but and I think they made really smart choices with optioning it. I mean, one of the things that always happens is you're sort of rolling the dice when you option it to someone. And so you don't know if they're going to do something good or bad or what kind of people they're going to get involved or what. And so I think they made a really, really smart choice. And my guess is they probably turned down a lot of people before they got to where they were.
And I liked the movie better than I liked the book, to be honest. And that was one of the rare cases that I liked the movie more than I liked the book. Usually I'm always like pro book, love the book, everything about the book. But I'm like, I actually liked seeing that one a little bit better than reading it and just kind of what I see in my head.
Well, and I thought the movie was fantastic as well. Yeah. So
I love the movie. Okay, so now do you know anything about your cast for Final Girl Support Group?
No, right now we're just interviewing writers and trying to get a writer showrunner on board. One of the nice / frustrating things in LA right now is it is very, very hard to find a female showrunner because everyone suddenly realized that they haven't been hiring them for a very long time. And when Me Too came along, everyone was like, oh crap, this is bad. And so right now, female showrunners are really in demand. And so you really have to like get the stars to align just right. So we're looking for someone right now because I think the producer and Charlize Theron and myself are all pretty committed to having a female showrunner on this. We just think it's the right way to go. That just means we're going to take a little longer. It's going to take a little longer to get running.
Okay.
Any chance you'll film in Georgia?
I don't know. It's Final Girl. My best friend's exorcism shot in Georgia, actually. It's wrapped. But they shot in Georgia. Yeah.
Wonderful. We're always pushing our entertainment industry here.
Yeah, no, Georgia is the place to be right now in terms of film.
If you somehow end up in Georgia, can I come see it? I'd love to be on set and see that. That would be so cool.
Oh, I mean, they're done. They've already shot.
Oh no,
but
no, I'm talking.
Yeah,
Final
if we do
Girl,
something new,
yeah.
No, totally.
Somehow you end up here.
Yeah. Well, it's I know Southern Book Club, when they get to shooting, will shoot in Charleston. So yeah, but people are always going down to shoot in Atlanta. Atlanta's a big deal. Are you guys all in Georgia or?
No,
I'm in Washington State.
Oh wow, okay.
And then we
you?
have 20 members. I'm in Woodstock, Georgia. So I'm in Cartersville right now. So I'm a little bit outside the city at my parents' house, but I live in Woodstock. So
And then Phyllis, you're in
I'm in Atlanta.
Atlanta.
Yeah. And Bailey, you're Woodstock?
right, Bailey?
Oh, she's
Yeah,
muted.
Canton.
So she's not too far from me.
Oh, got it. Okay. Every time
Canton's
y'all say
not too
Woodstock,
far.
I keep thinking of Woodstock, New York.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
Georgia.
Yeah, Woodstock.
But we have members all over. So we have 2 members in Michigan. We have 20 people that are in the club.
Oh wow.
That's one of the reasons we record, so that everybody that couldn't be here but read the book can still feel like they got to be a part of it or hear the questions and things like that, because that's important to me.
Oh yeah, no, I agree. I mean, is there anything anyone wanted to ask before?
Yeah, I have like an after the book question, and there might not be an answer to this, but do you think at some point Lynette pulls Heather aside to be like, hey, so the Dream King is still out there. Maybe we need to flush this guy out. Because that kind of sat with me throughout the rest of the book when I read that, when Chrissy was like, he's really out there, that I was like, well, maybe that needs to be addressed at some point.
Yeah, well, it's funny, sort of an outside the book thing that happened in the book is that the reason Heather saves Lynette at the end and is there when she needs to be and all that is because she is going to sleep in that panic cabin and, steps through the dream to get right to where Lynette is, right when Lynette needs her. And so the backstory on that is that it's the first time she's done that since she was a teenager. And that, we all know that a dream can feel like it goes on for years, and in reality, it's 20 minutes or less.
Yeah.
So, that subjective passing of time for Heather, she was in that sort of dream world, getting to Lynette for a really long time, slightly under a year. And so the reason she's not with them at the end is she's gone off to lick her wounds. She's in a bad place and not well. And so she's gone off to lick her wounds, to be alone, to try to get her head back together. Because even though she seems like a wreck at the beginning of the book, that wreck is doing pretty well for Heather. Like that's good. That's Heather almost at her best. Is what she's capable of these days. So I've always thought there was more there with Heather. I don't know if she'll go to do the Dream King, but definitely she's still out there, still at large, which I kind of like. I mean, to me, Heather's very much like a cat. Like no one owns Heather. She does her own thing.
She'll come back when she wants to.
When she's ready.
I did think though that I needed to, with the whole, since we're back with Heather and is it Christine? Who had the crazy
Chrissy.
house?
Yeah.
Okay. I thought, I really need to go back and visit my Jungian psychology because there's so much here and I'm picking up parts of it, but it's been a while. So.
Yeah. Well, it's really interesting. One of the things that came out doing the research after the book was it's really interesting to me how much that story of a woman and a male, a usually coded male monster, is a part of our culture. I mean, you look at the story of the unicorn, which is very much, the unicorn used to be a really fearsome beast. And the only way to capture it was, you sent a virgin into the woods all by herself and she would soothe and placate him so he could be killed, and his horn could be used. And so that image really goes way back. And one of the things that I thought was really strange is, in addition to that, and how far back that goes, that dead women are a really, really important part of our culture. Whether it's, the latest Scandinavian crime thriller, whether it's whatever it is, a dead woman usually is central to so many stories. And it's very strange to me. There's all the murder ballads coming out of the late 19th century. And it's everything from Mayor of Easttown to Friday the 13th part, whatever. For some reason, we build so much of our culture and our storytelling around a dead woman. And I don't know what it means. I don't know if it's good or bad. I don't know. But it's something that just kept coming up again and again and again when I was looking at this stuff going back. And I feel like it's something that I don't know what to do with that, but I'm really glad to be aware of it.
Mm-hmm. Do you think we don't have the empathy for a male victim that we do for a female victim? I watch the Scandinavian thrillers. I watch the true crime shows, and if they can get a female victim, I'm sure it's a lot higher than viewership or readership than a male victim. It's like, do we not have the empathy for a male victim? And if it is a male victim, does he need to be really, really young? I mean,
right.
Do we have to make that male victim a lot more attractive to the audience?
Yeah, and that may be, and there's certainly people who've written about that, where from a very pragmatic point of view, okay, we need a murder victim. Well, it could be a child, but no one wants a dead child. Like, dead children, I mean, they appear, but you try to not think about it too much. So what's next? A dead man? Dead woman? Now, women and children first, all that. Maybe. But then it's really interesting how much that victimhood gets coded onto women or attached to women, and I think it's I think you're definitely grabbing onto a thread, but I think it's such a knotty problem. Like, I don't know what the heart of it is. But I definitely think what you're saying, and not just me, but lots of people who've written about this definitely think it's the empathy thing. But then they try to sort of logic that out, like where that takes you, and it just gets so strange and complicated.
Well, what came first? I mean, I'm someone who grew up with the beautiful female victim. It was in everything. Mm-hmm. So is that why that resonates more to me? If I'd grown up at a different time or a time in the future where it's not always the beautiful female victim, but there's a different kind of victim, and then that person would have a different kind of bandwidth than I do, because TV, movies, novels were all the beautiful female victim. So I'm programmed at this point.
Right. And also, when did it change, right? Because in classical literature, male victims, they were fine. I mean, you get to stuff like Iphigenia, and no, I'm pronouncing it wrong. And that was certainly a woman sacrificed by her father to encourage good winds as he sails off to the Trojan War. But then you look at the story of, is it Isaac? The God in the Old Testament asked him to sacrifice his son. Yeah. And you certainly look in classical myth, and it's often young men, who are the victims of these fates worse than death and these horrible things. So you start wondering, like, when did it become so heavily skewed onto women, and why? And I mean, it gets very weird and deeper than I have the ability to parse out.
This has been a really interesting talk. It's been fun to kind of go back in history and talk about how things have evolved.
Right. Well, and one of the things that I always thought was interesting was, you look at the Minotaur story, and it very much fits that mold or slashers fit that mold, right? It's kids sent off somewhere remote and dangerous, where they face this monster that kills them one by one and has to be outsmarted because it can't be outfought. Although in that case, Jason is who defeats it is a guy. So, you know, you just see these same patterns repeating, and I don't know what to make of them, but it you know, what is it someone said, who's smarter than me? History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes.
Okay.
I like that.
Well, this has been
So
awesome.
no, and thank you for having me. I don't know if anyone has a final question, but then I have to go back to rewriting this book.
I just had a comment. I really liked Gnome Coming.
Oh, thank you.
I really want to know more about that. Like, where did Gnome Coming come from? Or
Well, you know, there was
want to have a gnome killer.
It was funny. Chrissy was originally, there was a whole bunch of Canadian tax shelter slasher movies that were made in the 70s and early 80s, because you got a giant tax write-off for shooting in Canada. And they're very distinct, and they're really their own thing. My Bloody Valentine's one of them.
Yeah.
And that was going to be Chrissy originally, but then I came up with the name Gnome Coming, just popped into my head. And there was a whole trend in the early 90s to have these slasher kind of movies focused on a monster. Leprechaun was one, Wishmaster was one.
It made me think of Leprechaun.
Yeah, and so then I was like, well, that's too good not to use. So so Chrissy winds up being sort of a mermaid. She's half man, half fish. She's half Canadian tax shelter slasher and half creature feature early 90s slasher.
I really liked it.
Yeah, no, and the art department was really excited to make that VHS cover for Gnome Coming. Well, thank you guys so much for having me. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you. This was so much fun. I'm like, this was probably my favorite. Just all the backstory and the history and the evolution. It's been really neat.
Oh, thanks.
So,
I really appreciate it. Well, definitely I'll stay in touch, and hopefully talk to y'all next summer.
please do. I was going to say, I'd love to have you back for your next book.
Cool. All right. Bye, y'all. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Let's see. Stop recording.